Well, the neighbourhood effect, it goes back to the 1990s. I think that's when it first came about. And it was the idea then that if you look at US inner city areas, say, for example, the south side of Chicago or the Bronx in New York, the idea is that, that people are poor in those areas, and that it's not simply that they're poor because of their individual characteristics, that they might be unemployed, that they might be on a low income. It's also that there's an additional effect over and above that of the individuals themselves. There's a collective effect of them living together within a neighbourhood. And the idea then of the neighbourhood effect is then that it's also passed on to the kind of the children, if you like, of the residents of that area. So in other words, then one of the reasons then why it is then that children growing up in poor neighbourhoods, that they might struggle, they might themselves then wind up being poor, is not simply because of the individual characteristics of their parents. It's also because the fact that they're clustered together in the same space together. So it's a spatial effect over and above that of all of the individual effects of them being in poverty. What then, as a result of that idea then, the argument then came from US urban policy, was that in order to break the neighbourhood effect, you had to spatially deconcentrate the poor. And in relationship then to US public housing, the projects, what it meant then is the idea that essentially, putting it crudely, you had to knock down the existing public housing, the projects, and then spatially disperse the residents. If you move them then out to more mixed tenure areas, then they will benefit because they will no longer be clustered in that space. Plus then, the idea is then that within the new area that you create, you then create new private buildings, so as you create what's called a mixed tenure community. So you'll have public housing tenants, those who remain in the area, plus new private homeowners. And the argument is then that there's a sort of some kind of process of osmosis almost, that the remaining public housing tenants, they will benefit by living cheek by jowl with these new private homeowners. So, for example, they might function, the new private homeowners then might function as role models. Or they might provide kind of like what's called beneficial social capital, bridging social capital, because it means then that they might be able to, because they're more likely to be in work, they might then pass on information about jobs to the lower income tenants. So that's the whole idea of neighbourhood effects. So then it gives rise to this idea that the best thing then you can do with these concentrations of the poor is to disperse the poor, either, as I said, by moving them out, or also then by creating new mixed tenure communities. And what that's given rise to is, as Mike Darcy says in a paper, it's a globalised discourse of deconcentration. And it's the idea then that one of the ways that the poor are located in inner city areas is because they're much more likely to live in social rental housing or public rental housing. So the argument then has swept right across the Western world, is that the best thing to do for the poor is to actually then eradicate the neighbourhood effects. And the way that you can do this then is by knocking down the existing public housing, the social housing, creating mixed tenure communities, so you don't have what are called mono-tenure communities, which primarily consist of social tenants, basically. That's the academic justification for it. It's highly problematic. It's very, very problematic because of the way that there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of studies of the neighbourhood effects, and there is no consensus whether the neighbourhood effects exist in the first place. Secondly, even if they do, what is the size of the effect? And C, what are the causal mechanisms involved? So, there's a good deal of academic, genuine academic concern as to, as to the whole neighbourhood effects argument. The problem is that despite these academic debates, the policymakers have simply gone ahead with policies which are by and large totally unproven. Plus, there's quite a good deal of research that's been done which suggests that actually clustering poor people together is not necessarily a bad thing. Because what happens is that there are all kinds of informal support networks grow up in lower income areas, poor areas, and those exist over time, the poor helping the poor. So if you disperse the poor into, wealthier areas outside of the city or other parts of the city, those networks are shattered. And certainly some of the work that I've done in London suggests that this is the case. Actually, the idea that the new mixed tenure communities are beneficial is problematic at best, really. Because again, it also assumes that the social relations which exist post the redevelopment are those in which the incomers, the new private homeowners, that they then genuinely interrelate in a positive manner with the remaining social tenants. There's a good deal of evidence which suggests that that isn't the case. Actually, what happens is there are quite clear class divisions between the new homeowners and the existing social tenants, and in many ways, the new incomers, they basically stigmatise and blame the existing social tenants for everything that's wrong in the neighbourhood. So it's not a kind of, it's not necessarily this kind of like beneficial social mixing. It can actually be quite conflictual. And plus, in many ways, simply, the new residents, again, if you look at the spatial configurations of how it is that the new estates, that the new redeveloped estates function, it's very clear that in many cases, people in the new private blocks, they're simply separated off. There is no social interaction. There's actually on the footprint of the old estate, the new redeveloped estate, there's very little interaction. So what you've got is gating. So there is no interaction, and basically again there's this phenomena of what I call selective belonging. In other words, then rich people move into an area, but they don't actually kind of like they don't really spend that much time in the area because their lives are basically elsewhere. So it's just simply a base. And that's often a way that particularly certain professional groups regard their homes in London. It's just a base. So the idea that you're living in a space, in a particular place, that's less important, really. So I think that the whole idea of, the intellectual rationale for neighbourhood effects, social mixing is deeply problematic, really.